Pastor Anthony Morris was once considered a symbol of unwavering devotion and pious stability, a spiritual shepherd, guiding his congregation through the moral turbulence of modern life. Born in rural Kentucky and later rising to prominence in Colorado, Maurice represented the kind of religious figure many communities longed for: articulate, unwavering in conviction, and outwardly disciplined in both religious and personal life. He first appeared in the public eye through his involvement with the Christian and Missionary Alliance, where he served as a respected minister before eventually transitioning to smaller regional churches. What no one knew at the time, what no one could have imagined, was the quiet, chilling secret he was cultivating in the shadows of his pastoral life. Maurice moved through churches like a wandering prophet, bringing with him a mixture of warmth, intelligence, and a strict moral code that he insisted his congregants adhered to. His sermons were deeply emotional, often focusing on themes of repentance, humility, and the need to resist the dark temptations of the secular world. Members of his congregation saw in him a man who had mastered his sinful desires, someone who had seemingly set aside every worldly indulgence to live a life of purity. Yet beneath the surface of these sermons lay a very different man, one trapped by urges he spent years hiding behind Scripture. Before long, Maurice relocated once more, joining a small but growing church community in Arva, Colorado, the kind of suburban town where spiritual leaders were trusted implicitly, where few questioned the intentions of those who preached about salvation and sin. Maurice quickly earned the admiration of older congregants for his eloquence and the loyalty of younger members for his approachable demeanor. He taught Bible classes, organized youth retreats, and became a trusted intermediary for families going through hardship. But in 2019, an unimaginable truth broke through the carefully constructed facade. The pastor whom everyone trusted had been quietly engaging in a pattern of criminal behavior, culminating in an arrest that sent shockwaves through the region. It began with a single report made to the local police. A worker at a gas station had witnessed a man behaving strangely, fueled by alcohol and verbal aggression. The man was identified as Anthony Morris. Police stopped him shortly after receiving the report, pulling him over in what seemed like a routine drunk driving case. What happened next, however, was anything but routine. Maurice, intoxicated and unstable, became verbally hostile, then suddenly attempted to flee. Officers managed to subdue him without casualties, but it was only after they searched his vehicle that the full truth emerged. Inside the car, they found a loaded firearm, a weapon Morris was legally barred from possessing. It did not take investigators long to piece together the troubling pattern. Maurice had previous incidents involving alcohol, reckless behavior, and escalating instability. His spiritual image had been slowly deteriorating, while his private life spun further out of control. The weapon charge alone was enough to bring serious legal consequences. But the true horror lay in what the arrest revealed about the duality of Maurice's life. During interviews, he admitted to struggles with alcohol, depression, and a widening gap between his public persona and private behavior. Congregants later testified that they had noticed subtle but troubling changes: slurred speech during sermons, erratic decision-making, and sudden absences that no one could explain. As the investigation expanded, so did public fascination with the story. Local news outlets began reporting on Morris, highlighting the contradiction between his respected position and the criminal charges now pending against him. One outlet pointed to his long-standing role within the Christian Leadership Board in Colorado, citing his influence over community events, youth ministries, and charitable programs. Others dug deeper, interviewing past congregants and former colleagues. A picture emerged of a man who had spent years balancing spiritual authority with personal disintegration, a man whose sermons about restraint masked a dangerous downward spiral. The arrest was only the beginning. Public attention intensified as Morris's trial progressed. Prosecutors emphasized the severity of the firearm possession, arguing that his role as a pastor made his behavior especially concerning. They presented body camera footage showing his impaired state, his attempted escape, and his aggression toward officers. They also highlighted inconsistencies in Morris's narrative, pointing out that someone who preached moral accountability should be held to the same standard he demanded of others. The defense, meanwhile, portrayed Morris as a man overwhelmed by emotional turmoil and untreated mental health issues. They argued that he had not intended harm and that the firearm had been purchased years earlier during a period of anxiety and crisis. They also suggested that the pressures of ministries, the expectations of perfection, The constant responsibility for others had pushed him toward alcohol dependency. Supporters from his former congregations wrote letters describing his kindness, dedication, and tireless service during natural disasters and community tragedies. But these letters were overshadowed by the stark reality of the evidence. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom fell silent. Morris was convicted of illegal firearm possession and sentenced accordingly. The news reverberated through religious circles across Colorado, causing church leaders to reevaluate their oversight procedures and crisis support systems. The congregation he once led held a series of emergency meetings, offering counseling to those who felt betrayed or spiritually shaken. For many, the emotional damage was profound. Children who once looked up to Morris as a father figure were left confused, their parents struggling to explain how someone who spoke so passionately about righteousness could fall so completely into wrongdoing. Media coverage intensified the sense of betrayal. National outlets began drawing parallels between Morris's case and other religious scandals, questioning whether certain church structures allowed leaders to hide personal problems behind their titles. Some commentators noted that Maurice's repeated relocations from one region to another had made it easier for him to reinvent himself each time, presenting a polished image that concealed growing instability. Others highlighted systemic issues within religious institutions, lack of accountability, insufficient mental health support, and a culture that often discouraged leaders from admitting weakness. After the trial, Maurice himself gave an interview from jail, a rare moment of direct insight into his private collapse. He spoke slowly, often pausing to gather his thoughts, describing how he had spent years trapped between his pastoral responsibilities and internal despair. He admitted that his sermons about resisting sin were attempts to motivate himself as much as his flock. "I was preaching the life I wanted to live, not the life I was living," he said. It was a chilling statement, because it suggested that even he, the man responsible for guiding others toward truth, had been unable to confront his own. As months passed, the story gradually faded from national headlines, but its impact remained deeply felt in the communities Morris had touched. Former congregants found themselves questioning their own instincts, wondering how they had failed to see the warning signs. Some turned away from organized religion entirely, while others used the experience to push for greater transparency and accountability within faith institutions. The church where Maurice last preached implemented new policies, requiring regular mental health evaluations for spiritual leaders, anonymous reporting systems for and background checks for all staff and volunteers. Meanwhile, Morris continued serving his sentence, reportedly participating in counseling programs and occasionally leading small prayer groups within the facility. But the man who once stood at the pulpit, delivering powerful sermons to hundreds, now spent his days in a small cell, reflecting on how his private weaknesses had destroyed not only his career, but also the trust of everyone who once believed in him. The most haunting part of the Morris case was not the crime itself, but the duality of the man behind it. He had portrayed himself as a guardian of morality, while simultaneously succumbing to the very temptations he condemned. This contradiction raised troubling questions about spiritual authority and human frailty. It forced congregations across the region to confront the uncomfortable truth that even those who claim divine guidance are not immune to personal collapse. In the end, the case of Pastor Anthony Morris stood as a grim reminder. When a leader hides behind Scripture instead of seeking help, the entire community pays the price. His fall was not sudden. It was the result of years of quiet deterioration, years during which the people around him saw only the polished surface and never the fractures beneath. And so the haunting question remains: how many other spiritual leaders struggle in silence, their public righteousness masking private turmoil, their sermons echoing with the very sins they cannot escape? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Samuel Wright was a figure who radiated calm authority. In the quiet town of Manchester, New Hampshire, many knew him as the soft-voiced leader of a congregation that believed deeply in his compassion and integrity. Wright had served in multiple churches over the years, eventually settling into a respected role within the Grace Baptist Church, a small but tightly knit evangelical community that looked to him for both spiritual guidance and practical leadership. To the congregation, he was consistent, reliable, and profoundly devout. He prayed with the sick, counseled troubled families, officiated weddings, and provided emotional shelter to those burdened by grief. His sermons were not theatrical, but thoughtful. He preached about redemption, discipline, and the importance of resisting worldly temptations. The people who sat before him each Sunday morning believed in his sincerity. Yet beneath the comforting sound of his sermons, beneath the careful posture of humility and spiritual righteousness, Wright nurtured a life that contradicted everything he preached. For years, a criminal obsession had taken root quietly within him, one that no one in his church suspected. The man who urged others to guard their souls from corruption was secretly embracing a darkness he could not control. The truth began to surface in 2021. Federal investigators were engaged in a wider sweep and ongoing effort by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and local authorities to crack down on individuals engaged in digital exploitation crimes. Their work involved identifying specific online patterns, IP traces, and distribution networks. During one of these investigations, a digital trail led to an address tied to Pastor Samuel Wright. The initial reaction among law enforcement was skepticism. Cases involving clergy always sparked disbelief. But the forensic data was clear. Downloads, file transfers, storage logs, all signs pointed to Wright's home computer. A quiet surveillance operation began. Agents monitored his online activity, watching patterns emerge. At night, after finishing pastoral duties and offering blessings to families, Wright would retreat privately into the digital world he kept hidden from everyone. Agents documented the behavior meticulously, ensuring that probable cause was unquestionable before taking the next step. Weeks of monitoring confirmed what investigators feared. The pastor was deeply involved in the possession and distribution of illegal materials. When federal agents finally approached the church parsonage, they found Wright preparing for an upcoming Sunday message. According to reports later documented in court, he appeared confused at first, almost dazed, when officers approached him with a warrant. But confusion quickly gave way to resignation. It was as if he understood instantly that his double life had come to an end. The search revealed everything investigators had expected and more: encrypted folders, external hard drives, hidden digital archives, and repeated evidence connecting him directly to illegal content. Wright was arrested on the spot. The news spread through Manchester within hours, tearing through the community like a violent shockwave. Congregants gathered in disbelief outside the church, many refusing to accept what they had been told. To them, Wright was a man who had dedicated his life to God. How could someone who spoke about purity and moral discipline fall into a crime so profoundly immoral? As the story unfolded in court filings and federal statements, the truth became even more disturbing. Wright had maintained his secret life for years, cleverly concealing it behind his pastoral responsibilities. He used his religious image as a protective facade, knowing the community would never suspect him. Prosecutors highlighted this element strongly, describing his actions as a profound betrayal, not only of the law, but also of the congregation that trusted him without hesitation. During interviews, former congregants described the sense of emotional devastation that swept through the church. Parents were horrified. Young adults who had sought mentorship from Wright felt violated by the trust they had placed in him. Elderly members, who had seen him as a spiritual son, struggled to reconcile the public figure with the private criminal. The community reeled, questioning how they failed to see what had been happening behind closed doors. The investigation continued for months. Digital forensics uncovered layers of behavior that pointed to systematic deception and methodical concealment. At trial, prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of New Hampshire presented a clear and devastating narrative that Wright had used his position of moral authority to mask years of criminal exploitation. They argued that his pastoral role heightened the severity of the betrayal. Wright pleaded guilty, fully aware that the evidence against him was overwhelming. The sentencing hearing was somber and emotionally charged. Victim advocates spoke about the broad harm caused by such crimes, emphasizing that every image represented real suffering and real victims. Congregants attended, sitting silently behind prosecutors, their faces marked with grief. Some cried quietly, others stared forward, their faith shaken. When the sentence was finally read, the courtroom was silent. Wright received a lengthy federal prison term, one that ensured he would spend the remainder of his active life behind bars. He was also ordered to register permanently under the terms of the National Sex Offender Registry, ensuring his name would remain publicly tied to his crimes. In the aftermath, Grace Baptist Church struggled to rebuild. Its leadership held meetings, counseling sessions, and support gatherings. trying to help congregants process their feelings of betrayal. Many asked how a man who preached about resisting sin could fall so deeply into it. Others questioned the structure of religious authority itself, wondering whether emotional dependency on spiritual leaders made communities vulnerable to manipulation. Local news outlets reported on the broader implications, pointing out patterns in similar cases across the country. Faith communities were urged to implement stronger transparency policies, regular digital audits for staff, and training to identify signs of concealed behavior. The case became a cautionary example used in seminars and law enforcement briefings on hidden offenders. As Wright began serving his sentence in a federal facility, reports emerged suggesting he had retreated fully into isolation. Inmates typically react poorly to individuals convicted of crimes involving minors, and Wright's former role as a pastor made him even more of a target. Prison officials reportedly moved him into protective housing units to prevent violence from other inmates. Throughout his incarceration, Wright participated in mandated therapy programs and religious services conducted by other inmates, but there was no redemption arc, no public apology that eased the community's pain. The damage was too deep and too personal. A pastor is not merely a public figure, he becomes woven into the emotional fabric of families. Wright had not only committed a crime, he had shattered the spiritual trust of an entire town. Over time, the case faded from national headlines, but within Manchester, its shadow lingered. Grace Baptist Church continued to operate, but the emotional atmosphere had changed. The new pastor appointed to replace Wright faced a congregation that looked upon religious authority with caution instead of unquestioning trust. Parents monitored their children more closely. The lingering question, how could he hide this for so long, remained unanswered. Perhaps the most chilling element of the Wright case is how seamlessly he lived his double life. He embodied the qualities congregants valued: humility, patience, a calm voice, an ability to quote scripture with conviction. Yet behind that soft-spoken demeanor was a man who, late at night, engaged in crimes that directly contradicted the values he preached. The duality was extreme, not a momentary lapse, but a fully formed second identity. And so the story leaves behind a haunting question. How many other spiritual leaders hide sins behind the confidence of their congregations? How many use the sanctuary of the church, not for repentance, but for concealment? The tragedy of Pastor Samuel Wright is not only that he fell into criminal behavior, it is that he used his position as a spiritual guide to shield that darkness for years. What looks like holiness from the outside may, in rare and chilling cases, hide something unrecognizably different beneath. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Matthew Dennis had been celebrated for years as the steady, reassuring voice of the small-town congregation of Bethany, Oklahoma, where people believed his guidance was as solid as Scripture itself. The church he oversaw, the Bethany Revival Center, was a place where families felt safe bringing their children, where struggling couples sought counseling, and where newcomers found warmth in the pastor's confident, fatherly presence. Dennis had an undeniable charm, the kind that made people relax instantly. He remembered birthdays, prayed for the sick by name, and visited elderly congregants when winter storms made them feel forgotten. To the outside world, he was a man whose devotion to his flock was unquestionable. Every Sunday he stood before the congregation with a worn Bible, preaching about the dangers of temptation, the beauty of redemption, and the sacred obligation to walk righteously before God. His voice, calm and authoritative, carried a weight that made people trust him deeply. When he said he was praying for someone, they believed him. When he said God had spoken to his heart, no one doubted it. The community wove him tightly into their lives. But beneath that polished exterior lived a hidden reality, one he had spent years cultivating and concealing. It was a world of addiction, corruption, and criminal behavior that would eventually expose him as a man who deceived not only his congregation, but also his own family. The unraveling began subtly, long before law enforcement became involved. Long before the town of Bethany realized its spiritual leader had been leading a double life. In the early 2010s, Dennis began showing signs of strain. Members of the congregation noticed he was more irritable, less focused during sermons, and increasingly distracted during counseling sessions. He dismissed these concerns by claiming exhaustion or spiritual warfare. No one pressed him, because the pastor always seemed to find the right words to soften suspicion. But behind closed doors, Dennis had started experimenting with prescription painkillers following a minor back injury. What began as a legitimate medical need soon spiraled into dependency, one he refused to acknowledge publicly, and one that quickly grew beyond pills. As his addiction deepened, Dennis sought stronger substances. He connected with individuals far outside the church community, people whose lifestyle and activities were the very things he warned his congregation to avoid. His downward spiral accelerated when he formed ties with individuals linked to the local drug trade. It wasn't long before he developed contacts associated with the Oklahoma Bureau of Narcotics, though he only knew them as suppliers. They didn't care that he was a pastor. They cared only that he was a steady paying customer. By 2015, Dennis had become entrenched in the methamphetamine market, not as a user alone, but gradually as a distributor. His personal addiction was expensive, and the pressure of maintaining the facade of a stable pastor made money even tighter. To keep up appearances, he needed cash. To get drugs, he needed connections. To maintain control, he needed secrecy. And so he found himself making decisions that would have horrified the people who trusted him most. He began using the church grounds to meet suppliers after hours. He justified each step to himself as temporary, as something he would stop once he got back on track spiritually. But addiction does not negotiate with good intentions. Soon, Dennis was storing drugs on church property, mixing pastoral duties with criminal activity so seamlessly that most congregants never noticed. The shift from user to dealer was gradual. At first, he sold small amounts to acquaintances to support his habit, but the profit potential, combined with the easy cover provided by his pastoral identity, pulled him deeper. No one suspected the pastor was transporting meth in his car after officiating a wedding or delivering drugs to contacts after leading a prayer group. Things escalated dramatically when Dennis became involved with a woman named Rebecca Thomas, who struggled with addiction and was connected to a distribution ring operating across several counties. Their relationship began as mutual dependency. She supplied him. He offered her money and sometimes shelter, but it soon became something far darker. Dennis found himself using church funds to support her addiction as well as his own. At times he justified it as helping someone in need, but he knew internally it was corruption. The breaking point came during a routine traffic stop. Rebecca Thomas was pulled over by deputies from the Oklahoma County Sheriff's Office for a broken tail light. In the vehicle, deputies found methamphetamine, paraphernalia, and a ledger with names and contact numbers that linked her to broader distribution activity. One of those names, written repeatedly with dollar amounts, belonged to Pastor Matthew Dennis. Detectives quickly noticed the inquiry. Why was a pastor's number in the contact records of a known drug distributor? Why were there frequent money transfers between them? Why had the pastor withdrawn large sums of cash from church accounts without explanation? And why was he often seen late at night in neighborhoods far outside Bethany? Investigators began quietly examining Dennis's activities. Bank statements, church financial records, surveillance footage, and digital communication logs painted an increasingly troubling picture. They discovered a pattern of unaccounted expenditures, nighttime movements inconsistent with pastoral duties, and communications that suggested drug transactions and coordinated distribution. Once detectives believed they had enough evidence to proceed, they confronted Dennis. He was pulled over in his own vehicle after leaving the church on a Thursday afternoon. Officers found methamphetamine hidden beneath the passenger seat, along with a scale and plastic baggies. His arrest sent shockwaves through the congregation. Members who had trusted him for years felt blindsided. News crews gathered outside the church. Parents who had allowed their children to attend youth programs under his guidance now felt sick with fear and confusion. During interrogation, Dennis initially denied everything. He claimed the drugs were planted, the ledger was fabricated, and the financial records were misunderstandings. But as agents from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration joined the investigation, the evidence became overwhelming. Phone records, text messages with distributors, and video surveillance of multiple exchanges all tied him unmistakably to the drug ring. Confronted with the reality that the evidence was insurmountable, Dennis eventually confessed. He admitted to years of addiction, involvement in distribution, and misuse of church funds to support his criminal activity. His confession, however, offered little comfort to the community. For many, the emotional devastation wasn't only about the crime. It was about the betrayal from a man who had held their hands during funerals, prayed with them during crises, and counseled their children during moments of doubt. The trial drew wide media attention across Oklahoma. Prosecutors from the Oklahoma County District Attorney's office painted a picture of a pastor who cloaked himself in religious trust to hide a secret life of addiction and criminal behavior. They emphasized the profound nature of the betrayal, a pastor dealing methamphetamine while preaching against immorality. In court, members of his former congregation attended in silence, some in tears. His wife sat rigid, devastated but stoic, while his children avoided all eye contact. The man they had once admired was now being portrayed as a strategic participant in a criminal network. His attorney argued that Dennis had fallen into addiction and was exploited by dangerous individuals. But the jury saw through the defense. The evidence was too strong, the pattern too clear. Dennis was convicted on multiple charges, including drug possession with intent to distribute, embezzlement of church funds, and conspiracy. His sentence was lengthy, ensuring he would spend many years in state prison. In the aftermath, Bethany Revival Center faced the painful task of rebuilding trust. A new leadership team was appointed, financial audits were introduced, and support groups were formed to help members process the emotional fallout. Parents became more vigilant, donations dropped sharply, and for a long time, the shadow of Dennis's actions lingered over every service, every prayer, every hesitant attempt at restoring faith in the institution. The story of Pastor Matthew Dennis left behind one haunting truth. The most dangerous betrayals are often those committed by people who stand behind pulpits, cloaked in trust, shielded by reverence. His double life forced the community to confront an uncomfortable reality. Not every pastor who speaks about righteousness lives by the words he preaches. For many in Bethany, the real wound was not the drugs, nor the criminal activity, nor the financial theft. It was the realization that the man who prayed with them each week, who claimed to protect their souls, had been leading a life soaked in sin and secrecy. And so the story closes with a question that still troubles the town. If a pastor, a man so trusted, could live such a hidden life, how well do we truly know anyone who stands behind the sermon? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the heart of Detroit, Michigan, where churches often serve as the last threads holding struggling communities together, Pastor Anthony W. Morris emerged as a symbol of hope. He led the Mack Avenue Community Church with a commanding voice and a reputation for compassion. For years, his congregation viewed him as a man who understood hardship, guided the fallen, and stood unwaveringly in the belief that faith could repair even the most broken lives. Morris was known for walking the streets after dark to hand out food to the homeless, offering counseling to addicts, and intervening in neighborhood disputes before they escalated. He spoke with conviction about redemption, how God could reach anyone, anywhere, at any level of despair. Those who attended his services believed deeply that he was not simply preaching the gospel but living it. He was the kind of pastor who remembered everyone's name, who hugged the elderly, who knelt beside grieving mothers during funerals, and who told children during Sunday school that they mattered. His charisma pulled in people from all corners of Detroit. Even those who'd given up on church found themselves drawn to the sense of warmth he fostered. But as the years passed, a darker reality began to take shape behind the scenes, one that would eventually expose Maurice as a man living a double life that no one in his congregation could have ever imagined. Morris came from humble beginnings. Raised in Detroit during a period of economic collapse, he grew up surrounded by crime, poverty, and uncertainty. His turn toward religion in his mid-20s had been seen as a miracle by his family. He'd gone from a troubled young man associated with street life to a respected community figure, and his testimony became a staple of his sermons. He spoke about how faith had saved him from temptations, how it had redirected him from the path many of his childhood friends never escaped. Yet the truth was more complicated. Addiction had never fully released its grip on him. Even as he preached about overcoming demons, he privately battled his own. His relapse into substance misuse began quietly, almost invisibly, and for a long time, he kept the facade perfectly intact. No one questioned the late-night drives, the unplanned meetings, or the mysterious phone calls he slipped away to answer. He was a pastor busy, needed, always on call. People assumed he was counseling someone or helping a family in crisis. Behind closed doors, however, Morris was once again slipping into the world he had once abandoned. His addiction to cocaine deepened, fueled by a growing circle of individuals who recognized that his position made him both vulnerable and valuable. He was a customer with influence, a man surrounded by trust and money. someone whose downfall could destroy not just himself, but an entire congregation. Those within the drug network exploited this, and Maurice, desperate to hide his dependency, made compromises he would never have imagined making when he first stepped behind the pulpit. His downward spiral expanded when he reconnected with former acquaintances involved in distribution activities linked to the Detroit Police Narcotics Unit investigations. Though Morris didn't know the full scope of their operations, he knew enough to understand that he was wading into dangerous territory. But once he began relying on them to supply his habit, his vulnerability became their leverage. He found himself pressured to transport packages, launder money, and serve as a quiet intermediary. He convinced himself it was temporary, that he could quit at any time, that he was still doing more good than harm. Yet every crime he participated in pulled him deeper. Eventually, Morris made the decision that would undo everything. He began using church funds to cover drug debts. The financial records at Mack Avenue Community Church showed donations steadily increasing. Yet the bank accounts told a different story, thousands of dollars unaccounted for, withdrawn in small increments, often on late-night dates that aligned suspiciously with known drug activity patterns. Congregants began noticing changes in him. His sermons became scattered, his energy drained, his once confident demeanor replaced by fatigue and agitation. He brushed off concern with jokes or excuses about stress, but behind the scenes, he was unraveling. The pressure of maintaining a double life was crushing him, and he sought escape more frequently through drugs, desperation making him careless. The beginning of the end came during an ongoing investigation by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. Agents had been tracking a mid-level distribution ring operating across Detroit, one that used couriers, stash houses, and shell participants. Among the names discovered in communication logs and transaction sheets was an unexpected one: Pastor Anthony Morris. Detectives were baffled. Why would a pastor's number appear in drug-related text threads? Why was he linked financially to individuals already under surveillance? Why were there late-night ATM withdrawals from church accounts occurring minutes before Morris met with known associates of the network? The agents began their investigation quietly. They observed Morris's movements, monitoring him from a distance. They established his routine when he left church, who he met with, how often he left the city, and how his behavior shifted from day to day. Over time, the evidence accumulated: exchanges in parking lots, visits to locations known to be connected to the distribution ring, meetings with individuals under D-monitoring. Then, during a larger operation aimed at dismantling the network, D agents executed multiple search warrants across Detroit. At one of the properties, they found documents connecting Morris to cash transfers and encrypted communications. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was direct. The final piece came when law enforcement intercepted a communication indicating Morris would be transporting cash to a supplier. When officers stopped his vehicle, they found tens of thousands of dollars hidden beneath the floor mats, money traced back to church accounts. His arrest stunned Detroit. Media outlets raced to the scene. Members of Mack Avenue Community Church arrived in disbelief, some crying, some refusing to accept the allegations, some furious that they had trusted him so blindly. The pastor they believed had saved them had instead betrayed them in ways they never could have predicted. During questioning, Maurice denied everything. He insisted the money was meant for a charitable outreach program. He blamed misunderstanding, malice, and misinterpretation. But even as he spoke, investigators were compiling an overwhelming record of his activities: bank statements, intercepted messages, witness accounts, surveillance videos, and physical evidence. His trial became one of the most discussed criminal cases in Detroit in years. Prosecutors from the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office detailed how Morris used the respect he commanded to hide a pattern of addiction-driven criminal activity. They laid out how church funds were diverted, how he coordinated with traffickers, how his pastoral authority made him an attractive asset for the criminal network. Witnesses from the congregation testified, some in tears. They described how Maurice had guided them through grief, how he had performed their weddings, baptized their children, and offered comfort in moments of despair. The emotional devastation of learning the truth left many struggling to reconcile the man they trusted with the criminal standing before the court. The defense argued addiction, pressure, and exploitation. They claimed the pastor had been consumed by forces more powerful than he could control. But the jury saw the full picture: a man who had made choice after choice to protect his secret, even as the consequences fell on the very community that relied on him. Maurice was convicted on multiple charges, including drug trafficking, conspiracy, and embezzlement of church funds. His sentence ensured he would spend many years in federal custody. In the aftermath, the church nearly collapsed. Attendance dropped. Donations dwindled. Faith, both spiritual and personal, was shaken. A new leadership group worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been destroyed. Counselors were brought in. Support groups formed. Community meetings held, but the shadow of Morris's betrayal remained, a constant reminder that even the most trusted figures can harbor hidden darkness. For many in Detroit, the pain was not simply the crime itself, but the emotional destruction that followed. People questioned their judgment, their vulnerability, and their beliefs. Some left the church forever, others stayed, determined to rebuild, but all were forced to confront a hard truth. Authority does not guarantee morality. In the quiet moments that followed the trial, a single haunting question lingered over the city. If even a pastor, a man trusted to lead souls, could fall this far, how can anyone ever truly see what lies behind the sermon? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For most of the 2000s, the people of Lakeville, South Carolina believed they were witnessing the rise of a truly exceptional spiritual leader. Gerald "Jerry" Staton preached with a kind of emotional force that made even stoic men wipe tears from their eyes. He spoke of redemption, sacrifice, and the dangers of material greed, all while telling stories from his own humble beginnings. To the outside world, he was a shining example of how faith could uplift an entire community. To those inside the congregation, he was a father figure, a counselor, a protector, and the living embodiment of the values he preached. But behind the booming sermons and the emotional altar calls was a man living a double life nobody could have imagined, a life built on manipulation, concealed debts, stolen funds, and one of the most elaborate schemes ever carried out by a small-town pastor. For nearly a decade, Staton orchestrated a massive fraud operation under the guise of charity and missions work, leaving devastation in his wake when it finally collapsed. Staton's church, Harmony of Grace Baptist, had grown rapidly under his leadership. What had once been a failing building with a dwindling attendance of 40 became a thriving congregation of over 1,200 people. Expansions were made, new sound systems were installed, a youth center was built, and Staton took every opportunity to emphasize how God had blessed the work of their hands. What wasn't known at the time was that nearly every improvement, every new project, and every emotional plea for donations was tied to Staton's hidden spiderweb of personal financial ruin. Before coming to Lakeville, Staton had been dismissed from 2 previous churches, one in Georgia, one in Tennessee. The official explanation in both cases was vague. Moral failings at the first, inconsistent conduct at the second, but no detailed reports were ever made public. And in the forgiving nature of the religious community, both events were soon forgotten. When he arrived in Lakeville, he spun both dismissals as trials of faith, telling congregants that he had been persecuted for preaching the truth too boldly. It was a story people wanted to believe, and so they did. The first cracks in Staton's image began with whispers. A deacon noticed that mission funds were being withdrawn more frequently than before. A secretary noticed checks written out to unfamiliar names. A youth pastor recalled seeing Staton's car several times at the State Line Casino, though Staton brushed it off as driving a struggling member to get help. But each concern was isolated, brushed aside, forgotten. Staton's charisma was overpowering once he fixed his warm gaze on someone, offering reassurance in that slow pastoral voice. Doubts melted. His downfall began with a single misstep, a forged signature. In 2014, Harmony of Grace launched what Staton called the Widow's Light Initiative, a charity supposedly dedicated to providing financial aid to elderly widows in the rural parts of South Carolina. Staton delivered a passionate sermon describing lonely women living in poverty, abandoned by society, surviving on canned vegetables and prayer. He wept during the altar call, his voice cracking. People gave freely, nearly $180,000 in the first 6 months, but almost none of that money ever reached any widows. Instead, Staton redirected the funds through a web of accounts he had set up under the pretense of managing missions. One of those accounts required a second signature, that of Robert Lee Mercer, the longtime treasurer of the church. Staton forged Mercer's signature on 3 checks, totaling nearly $40,000. Mercer discovered the forgery when reconciling end-of-year records. He confronted Staton privately, expecting denial or anger. What he received instead was a cold, calculated explanation. Staton told him, with no emotion, that the money had been reallocated for urgent ministry needs, and that exposing the issue would destroy the entire church and wound innocent believers. He reminded Mercer of his decades-long membership and implied that any scandal would tarnish Mercer's own reputation as treasurer. Mercer left the office shaken, disturbed by the manipulative tone from someone he had trusted for years. Unsure of what to do, he quietly contacted the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division SLED. Investigators began a discreet inquiry, cross-checking church financial records, interviewing vendors, and verifying the identities of the supposed widows who were beneficiaries of the charity. What they found astonished them. At least half of the listed recipients did not exist, and the other half had never received a single form of assistance. Meanwhile, Staton continued building his public image. He traveled to preach at conferences. He bought a new truck. He remodeled his parsonage home. Congregants saw these things as signs of God's favor. Behind the scenes, investigators built a case that would eventually lead to one of the most public pastoral arrests in state history. In March 2016, everything came crashing down. Staton was preparing for a Sunday service, arranging his notes, praying backstage, adjusting the microphone as the worship music played. Minutes before he stepped onto the stage, SLED agents entered the church, accompanied by uniformed officers from the local sheriff's department. The congregation watched in stunned silence as Staton was handcuffed and led out the side door. A woman fainted. Children cried. Grown men shouted at officers, demanding explanations. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, bank fraud, forgery, exploitation of vulnerable adults, and embezzlement. Staton's face, once associated with revival and spiritual strength, appeared on every news channel in the region. More details emerged in the days that followed. Staton had lost over $120,000 gambling. He had financed 2 separate extramarital relationships. He had taken out loans in the church's name without board approval. And the Widow's Light initiative was revealed publicly as a financial fiction. The trial lasted 8 days, but felt much longer for those who had trusted him. Former congregants filled the courtroom, some sitting through the proceedings with blank faces, others wiping tears as evidence was presented. Financial records, recordings of Staton's calls, and testimonies from church staff painted the portrait of a man who had weaponized spirituality to manipulate and take advantage of the very people who believed in him the most. Mercer, the treasurer whose forged signature sparked the investigation, took the stand, his voice trembling as he described the sense of betrayal he felt. One widow, whose name Staton had used to create a fake profile for the charity, told the court she had been humiliated to find her story exploited without her knowledge. Staton's defense attempted to argue that he had intended to reimburse the funds and that his gambling addiction impaired his judgment. The prosecution countered that Staton's actions were deliberate, repeated, and showed a clear pattern of deception spanning years. The jury deliberated for just 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all major counts. He was sentenced to 17 years in federal prison. In the aftermath, Harmony of Grace nearly collapsed. Attendance dropped by more than half. Members who remained struggled with trust, questioning how they had been so blind. The youth center shut down. Several longtime leaders stepped down, citing emotional exhaustion. The new pastor, appointed by an outside committee, described the environment as spiritually scorched earth. As for Staton, he was transferred to a federal correctional facility in Kentucky. Reports from inside indicated that he attempted to resume pastoral counseling with inmates, though officials closely monitored him to prevent further manipulation. Interviews he later gave through letters revealed a man who expressed sorrow but still avoided direct responsibility, a continuation of the deflection that had defined his ministry. The story of Gerald "Jerry" Staton remains one of the most painful in South Carolina's church history, a reminder that charisma can mask corruption, and that spiritual language can be twisted into a tool of control. For many who lived through it, one question lingers far longer than the legal consequences. How many warnings did they ignore, simply because the voice delivering them came from behind a pulpit? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the quiet suburbs of Tulsa, Oklahoma, The congregation of Riverbend Gospel Chapel believed they had been blessed with a leader unlike any other. Arthur Burton Hale, known simply as Pastor Hale, carried himself with a calm, fatherly warmth that made people feel instantly safe. His sermons were soft but powerful, his voice steady, his tone humble. He talked about forgiveness, accountability, and transparency. He often said he wanted to build a church where every secret is surrendered before God. But the only secret kept from the people of Riverbend was his own. For nearly 15 years, Hale crafted a persona built on compassion and moral purity. He visited hospitals late at night, prayed with grieving families, and offered free counseling to struggling members. He was the pastor who remembered birthdays, who organized community food drives, who quoted scripture with such sincerity that even skeptics lowered their guard around him. When he spoke, people leaned in. When he smiled, the room felt warmer. Behind closed doors, however, Hale was living a life so contradictory, so deeply hidden, that the truth would eventually shatter the faith of hundreds. His descent started quietly with the counseling ministry. Hale, like many pastors, offered private sessions for members dealing with marriages, addictions, and trauma. But unlike most, he insisted on holding these sessions in a secluded side office with no windows. He claimed the space was more intimate, a place where people could speak freely without fear of being overheard. He even installed soundproofing himself, telling staff he wanted absolute privacy for those seeking help. But privacy was not the reason. The first woman to report him was a newly divorced mother named Emily, but she wouldn't report until years later. During one counseling session, Hale sat too close. He placed a hand on her knee after she cried. He leaned in to comfort her emotionally. She froze, unsure how to respond. She trusted him. Everyone trusted him. She dismissed the moment, convincing herself it had been accidental. Months later, it happened again, and then again. Emily eventually left the church quietly, ashamed and confused. But she wasn't the only one who left without explanation. By 2014, at least 6 women had departed Riverbend, abruptly, each giving a vague reason or none at all. But because each exit happened quietly, privately, and spaced out over years, no one connected the dots. Hale had calculated it that way. Meanwhile, his public persona grew more polished. Donations increased. The church expanded. A new worship center was built. The board praised him for his steady leadership and ability to bring people together, and he used that trust to build deeper control. Then came the financial irregularities. The church treasurer, Gerald McKenna, discovered inconsistencies in the missions budget, missing funds that had supposedly gone to disaster relief efforts in Arkansas. When McKenna brought it to Hale, the pastor scolded him gently, saying he had redirected funds for urgent counseling needs within the congregation. McKenna apologized, embarrassed for questioning him, but the missing money piled up. By 2016, more than $70,000 was unaccounted for. Hale presented emotional sermons about spiritual warfare threatening the church finances, and people donated even more, desperate to help. They trusted him so deeply that few dared question his explanations, until one woman did. Her name was Caitlin Monroe, a 26-year-old worship singer and volunteer coordinator. Caitlin had been raised in churches her whole life. She knew what pastoral care should look like and what it shouldn't. When she went to Hale for counseling after losing a close friend, she felt the same discomfort Emily had years before. This time, she spoke up quietly to a female staff member she trusted. Within days, 3 other women approached that same staff member with their own unsettling stories. None of the women knew each other well. None had discussed their experiences beforehand, but their descriptions mirrored each other with disturbing precision. Hale sitting too close, Hale brushing hair out of their faces, Hale pressing for details about their romantic lives, Hale telling them that God sent you to me, because only I can guide you. When the staff member confronted Hale privately, he dismissed the accusations as emotional misinterpretations and attacks from spiritual darkness. He insisted the women were unstable and seeking attention. For a moment, she believed him. His calm voice and confident tone carried the same hypnotic charm he used on everyone else. But something in his eyes made her uneasy. She quietly shared her concerns with a board member, who reluctantly agreed to consult outside guidance. In 2017, a private investigator was hired to look into the pastor's conduct discreetly. They expected to find nothing. They had always believed Hale was incapable of wrongdoing. The investigator found more than they ever imagined. Financially, Hale had been funneling money from the missions fund into a personal account registered under an alias. He had purchased a second home in a nearby city, an apartment he used when traveling for ministry. But the investigator discovered something even more disturbing. Multiple women from other churches reported similar inappropriate encounters with Hale during guest counseling sessions he offered around Oklahoma. He had been doing this for years, leaving trails of discomfort and manipulation across several congregations. Armed with this information, the board confronted Hale formally in a closed-door meeting. What happened next was the moment that shattered his carefully crafted image. Hale didn't deny anything. Instead, he collapsed into a chair, trembling, claiming he had been tempted by darkness, that he had been lonely in pastoral leadership, that he never intended harm. He begged them not to go to police, insisting the scandal would destroy the church and lead hundreds away from God. But the board had already drafted a plan. They contacted law enforcement. Days later, multiple women filed formal complaints. Investigators from the Tulsa Police Department and the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation began interviewing victims, gathering financial documents, and mapping years of hidden misconduct. On a quiet Tuesday morning, officers arrived at Riverbend Gospel Chapel before the weekly staff meeting. Hale was handcuffed and escorted out the back door as employees watched in disbelief. News crews arrived within hours, broadcasting the arrest of a man once trusted by hundreds. The charges were extensive: sexual battery, financial fraud, misuse of church funds, coercion under spiritual authority. The case went to trial in 2019. Women from multiple churches testified. Their stories were nearly identical, each describing Hale's manipulation, boundary violations, and spiritual intimidation. Prosecutors argued that Hale had weaponized his pastoral authority, using faith as leverage to silence and control vulnerable members. Hale's lawyers attempted to portray the women as emotional, confused, or overly sensitive, but the consistency of the accounts, paired with financial evidence showing deceptive practices, dismantled the defense entirely. The jury deliberated for one day. Hale was found guilty on all major counts. He was sentenced to 32 years in state prison. The fallout for Riverbend Gospel Chapel was devastating. Attendance plummeted. Volunteers resigned. The counseling ministry shut down completely. The once thriving youth programs dried up. The community, once united under the gentle voice of a trusted leader, fractured under grief and disbelief. Caitlin, the whistleblower who first spoke up, struggled with guilt, but eventually found strength in counseling and support from other survivors. Emily, who had remained silent for years, finally stepped forward and confronted her trauma. Their bravery inspired others across Oklahoma to re-examine their church experiences and advocate for safer pastoral boundaries. Hale, meanwhile, retreated into a quiet prison existence. Reports from inside suggested he attempted again to counsel inmates, but officials restricted his access to vulnerable individuals. His second home was sold, his personal accounts seized, and the alias he had used for financial transactions was traced and dismantled. Riverbend slowly began rebuilding. A new leadership team implemented strict accountability measures, mandatory transparency for counseling sessions, and open auditing of all finances. The wounds remained, but healing slow, cautious healing, began to take root. The tragedy left behind a single haunting truth. A pastor who preached purity had hidden impurity beneath every sermon, and a community that trusted too deeply learned that sometimes the most dangerous sins are the ones committed in the name of God. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. In the bustling neighborhoods of Chicago, Illinois, Pastor James Jim Hawkins had spent decades building a reputation as a tireless advocate for the downtrodden. Second Hope Baptist Church, his small but active congregation, was widely regarded as a sanctuary for families in crisis, youth seeking guidance, and individuals struggling with addiction. Hawkins' sermons were powerful, filled with moral clarity, and his personal charisma gave him an aura of authority and trust. He spoke of God's mercy, the need for accountability, and the virtue of honesty, virtues he presented as the foundation of his life. Hawkins appeared incorruptible to the public eye. He spent hours visiting sick members, coordinating community food drives, and counseling troubled teenagers. The media occasionally covered his charitable work, portraying him as a modern-day saint in a city often marked by crime and distrust. Residents trusted him implicitly. Some even referred to him as a father of the community. a man whose word carried weight in both spiritual and personal matters. Yet beneath this image of integrity, Hawkins was leading a life of deception that would ultimately shock the city and devastate his congregation. The first signs of trouble began in the mid-2010s. Young adults who attended the church's after-school programs reported increasingly aggressive behavior during private counseling sessions. Hawkins, they said, had a way of gaining trust quickly, making them feel heard and valued, and then subtly crossing boundaries. Complaints were whispered privately among staff and parents, dismissed initially as misunderstandings or oversight. Hawkins' charm and reputation shielded him from scrutiny. Few dared question the pastor whose influence seemed limitless. What few knew was that Hawkins had long-standing financial troubles. For years, he had accumulated substantial personal debt due to failed investments and gambling habits. To maintain the church's image of prosperity and growth, he began diverting funds from charitable projects to cover personal shortfalls. Initially, these transfers were small, almost imperceptible, paying a bill here, covering a loan there. But over time, the amount grew, entwining his personal financial survival with the very institution he publicly claimed to serve. By 2017, the situation escalated. Hawkins became increasingly paranoid about being exposed and began manipulating staff to ensure loyalty. Longtime church treasurers noticed discrepancies in accounting but were intimidated by Hawkins' confidence and theological authority. He justified every financial irregularity with elaborate explanations, often quoting scripture about stewardship and divine providence. Staff members who questioned him were subtly threatened with loss of position or public shaming during sermons. The turning point came when an anonymous tip led investigators from the Chicago Police Department Financial Crimes Unit to open a formal inquiry into the church's finances. The investigators uncovered a complex web of misappropriated funds, shell accounts, and falsified charitable donation records. They also discovered evidence suggesting Hawkins had used his influence over vulnerable youth to gain sexual access patterns consistent with prior complaints that had been ignored. In interviews, former congregants recounted being groomed subtly over months. Hawkins would start by offering personal mentorship, emphasizing their spiritual destiny, then gradually making physical contact under the guise of blessing or counseling. For those too young to question authority, the manipulation was total, cloaked in religious justification. Law enforcement monitored Hawkins' activities for months, documenting meetings, phone calls, and financial transactions. They obtained warrants for multiple church-owned properties and personal residences. Inside the church office, they found evidence of falsified checks, ledgers with disguised withdrawals, and envelopes containing unreported donations. On the personal side, there were incriminating messages to former program participants that demonstrated manipulation and coercion. The arrest, executed in early 2018, stunned Chicago. Congregants gathered outside the church to witness officers handcuffing the man they had trusted with their spiritual guidance and the safety of their children. Families cried openly. Some fainted. Local news outlets covered the arrest extensively, highlighting the betrayal that had occurred under the cloak of pastoral authority. During the investigation and subsequent trial, prosecutors detailed Hawkins' multi-year scheme, diverting church funds to personal accounts, exploiting his position for sexual gratification, and creating an environment of intimidation to prevent reporting. Witnesses described his ability to present himself as benevolent, while simultaneously controlling finances and manipulating young adults. The pattern was consistent, calculated, and chilling. Hawkins' defense argued that some of the financial irregularities were clerical errors and that allegations of sexual misconduct were exaggerated or misinterpreted. However, the combination of financial records, digital communications, and consistent testimony from multiple victims left little room for doubt. The jury found him guilty on counts including financial fraud, sexual abuse of minors, and coercion. He was sentenced to 45 years in state prison. In the wake of Hawkins' conviction, Second Hope Baptist Church struggled to recover. Attendance plummeted, community programs were halted, and trust in the institution eroded. A new pastoral team took over, instituting strict financial oversight, mandatory background checks for staff, and comprehensive counseling safeguards. Survivors and families participated in therapy and community healing programs to address the trauma. The Hawkins case left an indelible mark on Chicago's religious community. It underscored the dangers of blind trust in authority figures, the subtlety of grooming and financial exploitation, and the long-lasting consequences of spiritual betrayal. Congregants who once praised Hawkins' guidance had to reconcile the pastor's public persona with the reality of his crimes, a task that took years and left scars that would never fully heal. The haunting question remained, echoing in the hearts of those who had once trusted him completely. How could the man preaching salvation be the same, one orchestrating so much destruction behind closed doors? What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.